All right, hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still somewhat on hold for a bit, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster Season 5, intriguing interviews with creative minds. Now, it's not every day you get to talk about one of your all-time favorite movies with the writer-director, but for me, tonight is such a night. So please welcome our guest, best-selling novelist and Academy and Emmy Award-nominated screenwriter and director, NICHOLAS MEYER. In addition to being the creative force behind Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and Time After Time, NICHOLAS is the author of the award-winning best-selling Sherlock Holmes novel, The 7% Solution, and contributed to various other films such as Fatal Attraction, Company Business, and The Deceivers, among others. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Great to see you. All right, just a heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or Nick in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, Nick, as we always do, let's start at the beginning. So where were you born and where'd you grow up?
I was born on the island of Manhattan in New York City, just after the end of the Second World War. I didn't end it, I just was born after it. And I grew up in Manhattan until I was 18 when I went to the University of Iowa.
So tell me about what was life for you in Manhattan at that time? What was it like growing up there?
It was a magic place. New York was at its absolute zenith as a community, as a society. There was a thriving and vigorous middle class, plays, ballets, operas, musicals, museums. They were affordable to everybody. And my parents made sure that I was dragged to all of these things. When I was old enough to protest, I hated the idea that they insisted that I wear a necktie even to Columbia football games. I think sometimes that I joined the movie business to get out of wearing that necktie. But that's sort of a broad summary of my post-war childhood. I went to PS 183.
Which is where?
66 in New York.
66 in New York, okay, wow.
They pulled me out of there in 4th grade because I was exhibiting learning difficulties. And so I repeated 4th grade, and they transferred me to the ethical culture school and then the Fieldston School on condition that I repeat the 4th grade. But I was too stupid to even understand that I was being asked to repeat it. So maybe that was a good thing.
So do you have brothers, sisters?
I have 3 sisters. One of them lives out here as a violinist. One of them is a painter in New York, and one of them is a psychiatrist in New York.
So of the 4 of you, where were you in the chain? Oldest,
First.
Oldest of 4. So did you guys? How much older are you than the oldest sister?
I think I'm somewhere 4 or 6 years older than my next of kin.
Did you guys? I mean, because of the age difference, did you get along? Were you close? Did you fight?
Yeah. All of that, I'm sure, was pretty normal.
Right.
He's a violinist. I guess we started by feuding. And then later on, we sort of teamed up. During the Vietnam War, we attended all those protest marches together. And I remember that we had a table outside the Plaza Hotel where she played the violin and I collected anti-war signatures on petitions. So we must have been getting along by then.
I was actually at one of the protests. I was actually at one of the Ronnie Kovac.
You never said hello.
Yes, well, I was probably because I was in a stroller.
Oh, well, that okay.
And my parents took me.
If you remember that scene at the end of the movie, The Way We Were.
Oh, right. Wow.
Outside the plaza where Robert Redford bumps into Streisand gathering petitions.
Right.
That's where we were.
Oh, wow. Wow. So
not the way we were, but that's
right. The way you guys were. So let me ask, so if I understand correctly, your father was a concert pianist, correct?
No, my mother.
Oh, your mother was. Your mother
My
was.
mother was a concert pianist. Her father was in the first violin section of the Boston Symphony for 25 years. And my father, who was a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, was a terrific pianist also, but he was, amateur status. But he was the greatest sight reader I've ever seen in action. You could put any piece of music in front of him on the piano, and he would play it off like he was, reading aloud from a book.
So so one of your sisters followed kind of your dad's footstep profession.
Correct.
One, your mom. Did you play music at all? Did that travel to you?
I was a parlor pianist, which is to say I was coordinated and I was musical and I had a prodigious memory. My real problem had to do with numbers, and no one diagnosed me at the time as having ADD problems, but numbers were very confusing to me. I'm not dyslexic, but I'm sort of dysnumerate. I don't know if that's a term, but and since music is essentially math, reading music was very, very difficult for me. As I say, I had some ability, but I wasn't really able to pursue it in the way that what I would consider as a serious musician should be able to.
Right. So we were talking just a couple of minutes before we got started about an uncle of yours down in Princeton. Tell me a little bit about, tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, this uncle, who was not related to me, he was married to a sister of my dad's, was described at his funeral without hyperbole as the greatest Hellenist since the Renaissance. He was the editor of the Harvard Loeb Plutarch. He was the author of the 2-volume Aristotle's Criticism of Plato and the Academy. He was, I think, the second PhD in Sanskrit, and he was Robert Oppenheimer's Sanskrit teacher at Berkeley. And after the war, when Oppenheimer became head of the Institute for Advanced Study, he invited my uncle and his wife to the Institute, where they spent the last 30, 40 years of their lives at 98 Battle Road. And I used to go down and visit them all the time. They had no kids, so I was a kind of a pet. And there were a couple of years there where we went down to have Thanksgiving dinners from New York. It was an hour train trip. And there were other people at those Thanksgiving dinners whom I later understood, because I was about 7, to have been Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Erwin Panofsky. And if your listeners don't know, Panofsky was the most famous iconologist in the world. So it was pretty exalted company, but the only story I ever heard about it was apparently I was sitting next to Einstein and said, "I have a hair in my turkey."
Wait, he said that or you said that?
I said it. I was the one with the hair. And he was the one who said, "Not so loud, everyone else will want one."
So hold on. So you are sitting at a table with, I mean, arguably 2 of the greatest minds of the 20th century. 3, 4.
Three if you count Panofsky, and 4 if you lump in my uncle. Yeah.
At a time when, to you, they were just, a couple of old guys, sitting at the table and you didn't know what was what.
I really didn't. I remember later asking my father why the man who proved to be Oppenheimer looked so sad. And he said, I don't remember his answer, what it was. "I'll explain it to you when you're older," or something. I can't remember. Something to that effect.
Wow. I mean, so now, with the, the ability of hindsight to look back, what do you think about the fact that you were at the table with those folks?
Well, I'd love to imbue it with significance, but I'm not sure it is significant. It's just something that happened. Somebody once recommended a general to Napoleon and said, "This guy is a very good general." And Napoleon said, "I know he's good, but is he lucky?" So maybe I just was lucky.
And then, I mean, did at any point, I mean, even after that, even when you got old enough to sort of look back and go, wait a second, I mean, I was sitting with Einstein and Oppenheimer. Did you then have conversations with your parents or your uncles and talk, and family, talk about this in a more, robust manner?
I may have done, but I'm not sure I remember the details. I mean, the only other detail I remember was that Oppenheimer's daughter, Tony, was there. And she had a horse. She used to ride her horse over the Institute grounds, which I deeply envied. And she had a dog with her, and she spoke to the dog in Czech. I think she was speaking Czech to the dog. And I tugged my father on the sleeve and I said, "What is she doing talking to the dog in Czech? The dog doesn't speak Czech."
So the memory that sticks out for you most, having had dinner with Oppenheimer and Einstein, was about a dog being spoken to in Czech.
Yeah, well, I was a kid.
I got to tell you, I don't know that many people in the history of existence who could
had a dog that they spoke Czech to. Be honest.
By itself, and then with Einstein at the table. Okay, all right. So when you were a kid, so your parents dragged you to this, that, and the other thing. It wasn't your thing. What were your interests as a kid? Like what were you into?
Oh, I should say that notwithstanding the hideous constraints of wearing and the obligation to being sort of tugged into that necktie, I loved everything they showed me. I loved every musical, every opera, every play, every ballet, every movie. It didn't matter. I was just soaking this stuff up like a sponge. And I was too young to understand what luck, what a privilege it was to grow up in this fairyland, really, where, went to the New York City Ballet when it was a young company. George Balanchine invented ballet as we know it. Every year, not only did I, see his more modern ballets, went to the Nutcracker, saw the Christmas tree get bigger and bigger and bigger, went to see Oklahoma, went to see South Pacific, Guys and Dolls, went to the Natural History Museum, which is a good place to exhaust any kid, by the way. You start by thinking you're going to run forever. In 10 minutes, you're collapsed on the floor in front of one of those amazing dioramas. It was all amazing. And it was all, and I can say that none of it was wasted on me. I just thought this is just great. I just didn't like having to wear the necktie.
So that's what sticks out. I had all this great culture, but man, I hate those ties.
I didn't think of it as culture. I had no such highfalutin term. I just thought it was fun.
Right.
And nothing has changed. I must say, I don't think I've changed about that.
Did you back then? Were you while you were doing being out, plays, the theater, the opera, and the like? Were you a reader? Did you like the movies? Did you like radio shows? Like what was your jam back then?
All of it. All of it. I started reading, I guess, fairly young, and I read The Three Musketeers, and I read 20,000 Leagues and The Count of Monte Cristo and Sherlock Holmes starting when I was about 11 years old. And movies, we didn't have a TV when I was, really young. So I went to the movie. I'd never seen a movie before, and I ran out of it screaming, terrified they were going to hang this guy. And later on, I fell in love with movies, fell in love with the star of that movie, thought that was all great. So what did you say? Books? You said movies. What was the other thing you said?
What maybe it was, radio shows or whatever.
Radio shows. I was addicted to those soap operas.
Right.
I started writing my own soap opera when I was a kid. I was writing my own stuff. I used to young Dr. Malone or Mary Worth, backstage wife, and there was a character whose name for some reason I remember was Edgar Grayling. He was a character on some show, and I would listen to that stuff after school.
So you were absorbing sort of
everything.
everything that you get your hands on, right? So you were reading, watching, listening, going and doing.
Nothing has changed.
Which is great. How did that talk to me about how that, when you started to say, all right, you know what, you talked about starting writing some of your own radio plays. Tell me when you really got serious, or you first got serious about writing.
People say to me, when did you decide to become a writer? And my answer is I never decided any such thing. It was just something I always did. And I started when I was about 5 years old, and I would dictate stories to my dad, who would write them down for me. And they were little stories about our dog, Limpy, and how she carried the newspaper home from the grocery store in her mouth and things like that. And then at some point he said, see here, or words to that effect, I'm tired of doing this writing. You do the writing. And then it was just a kind of reflexive thing that I did. It was a way of maybe sort of calming myself down, or I always loved stories, just stories. In fact, on my website, I don't say filmmaker, writer, director, novelist. I say storyteller. I'm a storyteller.
Right.
And that started when I was 5.
So clearly you had mentioned, of all the various, everything that you were absorbing, you mentioned Sherlock Holmes, and clearly Sherlock Holmes had a significant impact on you. It's kind of, you sort of absorbed it pretty substantially. Talk to me about kind of your fascination with Sherlock Holmes.
Well, as I say, I was about 10 or 11 when my father gave me the complete Conan Doyle Holmes stories, of which there are 60. And I must have gobbled them all up. And at the same time, I was also reading Jules Verne. I was also hooked on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I'd seen the Walt Disney movie, which I still think is the best movie Disney ever made. And I got hooked on all that stuff. And Holmes in particular intrigued me for ways that I couldn't for a long time quite put my finger on. I should say detective stories are interesting for a curious set of reasons, which I hope we'll come back to. But Holmes as a particular character resonated with me in ways that it took me a long time to figure out. And it wasn't until maybe I was in high school and people would say to me, oh, your old man's a shrink. Is he a Freudian? And I didn't know.
Right. So
I said to my dad one night, I said, Pop, are you a Freudian? And he said, well, it's a silly question. And I said, why is that? And he said, because it's no more possible to discuss the history of psychoanalysis without starting with Freud any more than you can discuss the history of America or the discovery of America without starting with Columbus or the Vikings. But to suppose that nothing has happened since those guys is to be pretty rigid, pretty doctrinaire. And he went on to say, when a patient comes to see me, I listen to what they say. I listen to how they say it. I'm especially interested in what they don't say.
Right.
I'm curious, are they on time? How are they dressed? What's their body language? I am, in short, searching for clues from them as to why they are not happy. And this little light bulb went off in my head, and I suddenly knew who Sherlock Holmes always reminded me of was my dad.
Wow, yeah.
Because we would have these conversations and he would say, what do you think about a guy who always shows up 5 minutes late? And we'd all take turns around the table. Well, maybe he doesn't have a watch, or maybe he doesn't want to be there, or maybe he wants you to know he doesn't want to, all these things. And then when this thing happened, I found myself, and by this time I was maybe 15, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was 12, maybe I was 16, but I just remember thinking, gosh, I wonder how much Freud knew about the life and writing of Arthur Conan Doyle, and I wonder how much Arthur Conan Doyle knew about the life and writing of Sigmund Freud. And the first thing you realize, or the first thing I realized is, well, they're both doctors, and they both died in the same town, London. and they both died within 9 years of each other. And you know what else? They were both interested in cocaine. Sherlock is a cocaine user, and so for a time was Sigmund Freud.
Right.
And out of these high school associations over a period of many, many years, and because I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer or the fastest thinker, ultimately became the book, which is The 7% Solution, and everything that followed from that conversation.
Right. So that was it. That's what kind of where I was headed. So, you obviously have this love of Sherlock Holmes. So I want to ask you, so what was it like to write about Holmes in the 70s with the 7% Solution, when at that time, not that many others were writing Sherlock, and
nobody was doing it. It's not that there had not been other Sherlock Holmes stories written over the years, but I pretty much had the field to myself. I think Ellery Queen did Holmes versus the Ripper, and earlier Monsignor Reginald Knox, or Ronald Knox, I can't remember his name. He wrote some. There had been occasional, but first of all, nobody was doing it, and nobody that I knew was interested in it. And I probably would not have sat down to do it had not the Writers Guild of America, of which I am a member in good standing and dues paying and all that, gone on one of its periodic strikes. So I was living in Los Angeles by then. This is like 1972 or 73, and trying to make my way in the movie business, and suddenly being told that I was not allowed to write screenplays. And so a friend of mine and my girlfriend at the time said, well, now you can write that Sherlock Holmes thing you keep nattering on about.
Right.
And they were right, because aside from picketing the Goldwyn Studios for 3 hours every day with a sandwich board and everything, I didn't have anything else to do. So I sat down to write it. And God knows it had been taking shape in my mind for many, many years by that point. And I began by writing it on a typewriter, and that wasn't really working, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I thought, well, maybe you should do it longhand the way Doyle did. So I believe that I wrote most of the original draft in longhand.
Wow.
And then started, transcribing it on my Smith Corona portable electric, which I've since given to Robert Caro, because he writes on them.
So it's interesting. So within the narrative, the 7% Solution, because you had mentioned Sigmund Freud, and nowadays in modern fiction of all kinds, the idea of sort of getting into drug addiction and root causes like the physical addiction, the chemical addiction, and then the underlying motivations for that addiction. You were talking about that in the 7% Solution almost decades before it became sort of more widely popular. I'm assuming this, this comes from the conversations with your dad. But not only was Freud part of the narrative, he was also part of the action too, right? So
yeah, I made him into the, when Alan Arkin played him in the movie, he said he did all this research on Freud and everything, and then he found out that it was all useless because I'd basically based him on my dad. And my dad, I guess, to me, was a bit of an action figure.
Did your dad know? So when it came out, was your dad still alive when it came out?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. What did he think?
I think he was tremendously tickled by the whole thing. And remember, when you're writing this and when you're writing anything, chances are nobody knows that you're writing anyway or gives a shit, and you're just you and a piece of paper or a computer, whatever it is.
Right.
And that was me. I didn't expect anything, except by the time it was finished, I thought, well, this has got to be at least publishable. It should be publishable. But certainly it was not in my mind that it was going to be the #1 best-selling novel in the United States for 40 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list.
Well, that's a nice surprise.
I don't, you could have knocked me over with a feather.
Yeah.
I was, astonished, and so was he. But he ultimately, I think, decided he was tickled pink.
So I recently rewatched Time After Time, which I had seen many times growing up. So my question for you is, what was the impetus to put H.G. Wells kind of in the Sherlock Holmes role, with Jack the Ripper maybe as a quasi Moriarty, and Amy Robbins, who I only realized recently was who in real life is who H.G. Wells married.
I should digress long enough to say that typically I don't get ideas. I sort of trip over them. The 7% solution was like me kind of getting an idea, but that doesn't happen a lot. Time After Time was somebody else's idea. It was another writer whom I met at the writer's workshop at the University of Iowa, which is where you go if you want to study writing.
Right.
And Carl contacted me after the 7% solution was a big hit. And he said, I'm writing a novel that was kind of inspired by the 7% solution. I have 65 pages and an outline. Would you read it and tell me what you think? And back in those days, I had time to burn. So I said, sure, I'll read it. And I read it. And there was his idea. And I gave him a whole bunch of notes, what I thought it should be, blah, blah. And then I sort of forgot about it, except I couldn't forget about it because it was such a cool idea. And I would lie awake thinking, wow, I don't even see this as a book. It's really such a visual idea.
Right. Absolutely.
These two guys in Victorian outfits running around San Francisco. That's a low budget, and it reminded me of the Jean-Luc Godard, the Alphaville movie, which had made such a big impression on me when I saw it. And again, slow thinker, right? So like 4 months later, I wake up at 4 a.m. and say, you're an idiot. Why don't you option his book?
Right.
And so that's what I did. I optioned
wow.
the book. And by that time, I wrote the thing in 6 days or something. Boom, 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 boom. Because I'd worked it all out in my head using his idea.
Wow. Well, if I having literally just watched it 2 days ago, it holds up really well.
Oh yeah, those things turned out to have been built to last.
Yes, they
which
really
which I'm very proud of. I think the stuff that I like of mine the most is stuff that does hold up.
And it's even great, even from the opening scene, it's that shot, you're behind the fence, like the cast iron fence, and the fog rolls in, and you just kind of sucked right in from the very opening frame. It was good stuff. So as a child of the 70s and the 80s and the Reagan era, I vividly remember watching.
I thought you were going to say the Reagan era.
No, well, that as well. I vividly remember watching The Day After, and it really shook me at the time because I was, I don't know, 12, 13, something like that. I can't remember.
It shook up people older than you.
Yeah. So how did that movie come together, and what was that like for you to make such an intense movie?
Well, it was a sort of an accident. I had done, at this point, I think the 7% solution, which I wrote but did not direct. I had done Time After Time, which I wrote and directed, and I had done Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which I wrote and directed. And I have never been, I guess, very systematic about planning a, quote, career. I just kind of bounce around like those pinballs in the machine, just hitting things. And I was invited, for reasons that I have no idea why I was invited, to direct this ABC television movie about nuclear war. I later found out that I was at least the third director who had been offered this. And I was at the time being psychoanalyzed. And that means you lie down on a couch
Yep.
3-4 days a week, and you say whatever comes into your head. And your shrink doesn't talk. At the end of the hour, he might play back what you have said and hook it up a little bit like a film editor with dailies and say, today you seem to be talking about, but he doesn't volunteer things. The patient is doing all the heavy lifting. And on this day, I was lying on the couch trying to talk myself out of doing a movie about nuclear war, because who wants to do that?
Right.
Nobody wants to think about it. We all know that we could be incinerated at any moment, but we prefer not to think about that. I sure preferred not to think about it.
For sure.
I was having a good time, but I knew what my politics were. I knew that nuclear weapons scared the crap out of me. When I was a kid in New York, and we had to wear dog tags and hide under desks from the nuclear bomb, I used to think that every low-flying plane over where we lived, could be the one.
Right.
I'm lying on the couch and I'm going to talk myself out of doing this movie, and my shrink, to my great astonishment, opens his mouth. And he said, well, I think this is where we find out who you really are. Yeah.
Wow.
I thought, oh, I wish you hadn't said that, because then I knew I was going to have to do the movie.
Right. Wow.
And that's how I got involved in it.
So when you were making it, I mean,
And I got a lot of other people involved by using that line, by the way.
Right.
I went to Gain Rescher, who was my cinematographer on The Wrath of Khan, and I said, we're going to do this day after movie. And he goes, oh, no. Come on, don't ask me to do that. And I said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. The one time this town gets you to gives you the opportunity to put your work in the service of your beliefs, and you're going to pass and instead bitch at dinner parties about the state of the world, I think this is where we get to find out who you really are.
Wow.
And yeah, I crowbarred a bunch of people with that line.
Wow. So
when you wanted to do this,
right. So as you were making it, did you feel, I mean, because obviously, it's a movie and you've got the sets and that what you're doing is fake, and, it's all, predetermined what happens, but was there a sense of weightiness as you were making it?
Henry James said that life is hot, but art is cool. If you are the puppeteer, you cannot be out front sobbing at the performance.
Right.
You must stay backstage dry-eyed and make sure the strings do not get tangled. So making the movie was a business.
Right.
It was a process, and it required objectivity and a kind of dispassion in order to achieve ultimately what we wanted to achieve. And one of the things that I figured out in the process of making the film was that I didn't want it to be a good movie, because if it was a good movie, people would talk about the movie and not about the subject. I didn't want people saying, my God, look at that cinematography.
Right.
I didn't want people saying, oh God, Jason Robards, the performance of a lifetime. I didn't want the performance of a lifetime. I didn't want cinematography that called attention to itself. I didn't want any music in the movie. I didn't want to be accused of goosing anybody's emotions. I wanted, at the end of the day, to make a kind of public service announcement.
Right.
If you have a nuclear war, this is what it's going to be like on a good day.
Right.
I didn't even want to do the whole full Monty, because people would reach for the clicker.
Right.
So that is an intellectual process.
Right.
And that, kind of kept me, I know that some of the actors had nuclear nightmares. We used to call them nuke-mares. Steve Guttenberg and Joe Beth Williams, and maybe John Lithgow also.
Wow. I guess for you, I guess you really had to be, guess given the, the subject matter, if you're caught up into it,
There was a lot of black humor too. It
right?
was like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if there was a nuclear war
Right.
while we were shooting? And, we would get some footage that would, this stupid stuff just to get you through it.
Now there was on the show, I don't know if you ever saw it, the TV comedy Scrubs that was on a while ago, some years ago. There was one episode where, they're looking in through a patient's window and the patient's got to forget some terrible health condition, and they're kind of outside making jokes, and one of the doctors says, how can you really, how can you do this? How could you be so insensitive? And ultimately says, we don't make the jokes because it's fun. We do it because we got to get through the day to be able to treat these patients. A little bit because it's fun, but mostly because we can't live in that space or we're useless.
I think there's a moment in a Howard Hawks, Cary Grant movie about aviators where one of them gets shot down and they're all sitting around singing and making jokes. And I think it's Jean Arthur, but I'm not sure it's Jean Arthur, who goes kind of berserk on them and say, how can you, do this? How can you laugh and make these jokes? And Cary Grant or somebody says, how else do you think we're going to get through this? So, yeah, there's that.
All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. Let's go back just a year or two. Let's go to this day. The Wrath of Khan remains one of my top 5 movies of all time. I've seen it
Thank you.
I've seen it countless times, and I actually got to see it again. I saw it on the screen when it came out, and I got to see it again a few years ago on the big screen during the Shatner tour, which was just fantastic. Now, I'm sure you've talked about this movie a gazillion times. Tell me something about the making of this movie that you've never told anyone before.
Let me free associate, because that's all I
Okay.
can think of. I think, and I've said this before, but I think it's a good, I think it's the only jumping off place I know. I think artists lose all proprietary authority over their works as soon as they're finished. Once they're out in the world, they're no longer yours. Your opinion becomes just another opinion. It can't be definitive. Everybody will make of a painting or a piece of music or a movie whatever they will. And I certainly had no idea while I was making the movie, any more than I did while I was writing the 7% Solution, that I was creating something that might at some point ever be considered memorable. It didn't cross my mind. I was having a lot of fun, because directing a movie is a lot of fun. If you can, stand the 24-hour, you need to be strong. You need to be physically strong. You have to have a thick hide to do it. And I did have fun. I was not a Star Trek fan. I'd never seen it until I met Harv Bennett, the producer, and he showed me it. So what I have to say about Khan, I don't think is likely to be particularly revelatory or insightful. I also, think, again, going back to the idea that artists don't really have anything to say after they've said the thing. Somebody watched Margot Fontaine at the ballet and went backstage and said, "Gee, Dame Margot, I so enjoyed your dancing. Tell me, what were you doing up there?" And she said, she had the presence of mind to say, "I'm very sorry, but I explained what I was doing while I was doing it. If you didn't understand me, then I failed." And treating the artist as if he is the answer to a book of equations and in a mathematics textbook, I don't think is very fruitful. Our answers may or may not be interesting, but they're anecdotal and they're not definitive. I once heard somebody ask Billy Wilder if 1, 2, 3 was a political film, and putting aside that I didn't know what the definition of a political film is, the implication was that if he said, no, 1, 2, 3 is not a political film, and you had had political thoughts while watching it, that you were somehow wrong. So when people ask me about The Wrath of Khan, most of the time I don't quite know what to say. And they say, why did Khan wear only one glove? And I go, why do you think he wears only one glove? Sort of. So I don't know what I can tell you. It's taken a very long time answering your question. I don't know what I can tell you about it that I've.
Well, let me ask you this. So you said that you weren't, up until that point, you weren't a Trekkie at that point. You got introduced to you late. Do you think that helped at all sort of keep, let's just say, kept like the fanboy out of the equation while you're making it? Did that help at all?
Oh, I think it did. That I think it did. Again, this is speculation, and it's speculation with hindsight, so you have to take it with a ton of salt. But I did not approach this with reverence, which somebody might have found inhibiting.
Right.
I was not inhibited because I didn't know what I was monkeying with,
right.
What bear I was poking with a stick. All I knew was that once I got into my head that what Star Trek really reminded me of, which I felt I knew how to relate to, were these books that I read as a kid, the Captain Horatio Hornblower books about this sea captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. And he had a girl in every port, and he had a lot of adventures. And I loved all that. And I loved Gregory Peck as Captain Horatio Hornblower in the movie. And I thought, okay, this is Hornblower in outer space. And this is about battleships or destroyers or submarines. And I loved all that stuff, going back to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Right.
And even more to a movie that I didn't even realize had influenced me until 30 years later, I remembered, was a movie called The Enemy Below, with Robert Mitchum as the destroyer captain and Kurt Jurgens as the German U-boat captain. Right. And that duel, which found its way into the Mutara Nebula.
Right, yeah.
And nobody ever remembers who directed The Enemy Below. Was Dick Powell.
Dick Powell, wow.
Very, very good movie.
So let me ask you, so Ricardo Montalban's Khan is one of the great villains of all time, and certainly one of the most memorable. So what was it like to work with him then?
He was one of the loveliest people, certainly that I ever, found myself working. This is the only business where you shake hands with your dreams.
Right.
And Ricardo's credits were longer than anybody's. And he was a very great actor. He had already been on Broadway with Lena Horne. He had already been in, I can't remember whether it was Man and Superman or Don Juan in Hell on Broadway of George Bernard Shaw. This was not nobody. And he was the only one that I didn't get to rehearse with because he was doing his Fantasy Island television series. So all I did was I got to meet him. I had lunch with him. I gave him a copy of Moby Dick. I said, here, this is it. And then I didn't really meet him after that lunch until the day he came to shoot with his real chest, I might add.
Wow. Do you think? Right, go ahead.
So I didn't know, and was always so polite and so courtly. And like all actors, they have one question about the director. Is he crazy? Am I going to live? Or am I going to have to pull the boat over the mountain?
Right.
They're all kind of wondering about that. And we started with his opening scene, which is a 6-page monologue about why he's enraged with James Kirk. And because this is like the third movie I ever directed, and I sort of came out of theater, and I thought, movies you're always saying cut. You never let the actor work up a head of steam before you go cut and move the camera. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do this all in one move and see, let him do it uninterrupted.
So to breathe a
So
little.
I laid out, this is the first day, he's in full regalia with the wig and everything. And there were 23 marks that he had to hit. And I showed him where they were, and he was letter perfect. And he hit every mark.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, but
But
he yelled the whole thing at the top of his lungs, and everybody was like,
whoa.
leaning, the crew was everybody. And I thought, what do I do? If I try to tell this guy something, is he gonna like pull rank on me, little whippersnapper? And I know, because he was like big, tall guy, and so I said, well, okay, now that we've outlined the blocking and they're going to do their lighting, let's go into your trailer and chat a little bit about the part. And so he's okay, and went back there, and I said, Laurence Olivier once said that an actor should never show an audience his top, because once you show them your top, they know you got no place else to go.
Right.
And he said, oh, he said, you're going to direct me. He said, that's good. He said, I don't know what I'm doing up there. I need all the help I can get.
Oh, that's great.
And then he started to tell me stories about working for Mervyn LeRoy and this one and that one, who would say to him things like, Ricardo, Lana, make it a good scene. And that he didn't know what to do with that information.
Right.
So we had this, what became was a very intimate collaboration. It's the only time I've ever felt like what it was like to drive a Maserati, because you didn't have to tell him much.
Right.
You didn't have to push on that pedal or that brake very much. He could finish your sentences once you started them. And I would say to him, if you're really a crazy person, the thing about a crazy person is that they probably never have to raise their voice, because you have no idea what they're going to do next.
Right.
And she left back. Okay, we got
You got it. Wow, that's fantastic. Wow.
So that's my Ricardo story.
All right, great.
He was a great guy. He was a great guy.
Wow. So let me ask you, so what was it like for you? So just last week, Captain Kirk himself took an actual real life space flight.
I'm dying of envy.
Yeah.
I'm dying of envy.
Wow. That's trippy, right? Watching Captain Kirk.
Oh, there's something so wonderful about it.
I mean, how could you, that's sort of, that's the kind of thing that you would think somebody made up, right? The real life space a fake space captain goes into a real life spaceship. Something. So let me go back to talking about, we were talking about Sherlock Holmes, the theme of it. So Star Trek VI has a very distinct Holmes-like mystery within the larger narrative. So tell me how that came together.
I don't remember how it came together. I just remember that at one point when I was writing the script with Denny Martin Flynn, I found Spock quoting Holmes. And I just prefaced his quote by saying, an ancestor of mine once remarked, thus implying that he was descended from Holmes. And people who go to the movie and recognize the quotation always go nuts, going, oh my God, that makes such perfect sense. That Sherlock Holmes sired somebody who eventually sired Spock. All roads lead to Holmes, including my latest book, The Return of the Pharaoh, that it all comes full circle.
Which we could get to in just a minute. So just a quick interlude for the folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments for me or Nick, send them in the chat box and we'll get to them in a bit. All right, Nick, you just mentioned it. I'm going to share my screen right now because I want to show everyone what you've got next. Just bear with me just a minute. And then we are going to talk about your book. Okay, we got this and we got this and this. Okay, so we are now looking at your new book. What do we got here? Talk to me.
Well, this is I think it's my fifth Sherlock Holmes novel. It comes out November 9th. And you can pre-order it wherever. And it's Sherlock Holmes finds himself in Egypt in 1911, investigating the disappearance of an English nobleman who has gone prospecting for Egyptian archaeological artifacts, as many rich people, not only rich English people, rich French people, rich Germans and Americans, went to Egypt looking for plunder. Some of them were serious archaeologists, and some of them were adventurers looking for Egyptian gold. Some of them were a bit of both. And here was a nobleman who's gone looking for Egyptian stuff, and he's disappeared. And his wife hires Holmes to go to Egypt and try to find this guy. And once in Egypt, Holmes is astonished to bump into his amanuensis, his Boswell, as he calls him, John Watson. And Watson is in Egypt because his wife is suffering from consumption, and she's gone to Egypt to be in a dry climate for the winter in the hopes of arresting the progress of her disease. And of course, as you might anticipate, Watson becomes involved in the mystery of the vanished nobleman.
Wow. So let me ask you, what was your motivation to come back to write a new Holmes book?
Well, I write them when I get ideas for them. Between the time I wrote The Canary Trainer, which was published in 1993, and the time I wrote The Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols, which was published in 2019, it's 26 years where I wasn't doing it because it didn't get a cool idea.
Right.
And two things contributed to the return of the Pharaoh. And one was a cool idea, which was Holmes in Egypt, which was proposed to me by my friend, agent, manager, Alan Gasmer, to whom the book is dedicated. And secondly, COVID, which, kept me housebound. And so with this time on my hands and this idea buzzing around, thanks to Alan, and also I think all those Egyptian movies that I grew up loving, Land of the Pharaohs, The Egyptian, Valley of the Kings, Spartacus, Cleopatra, whatever those things were that I soaked up like I soak up everything else. And I thought, yeah, this could be so cool. And it made such sense. And I think what happens to me is as I say, you trip over an idea or somebody gives it to you. And if it's a really good idea, you can't stop thinking about it.
Right.
If it's a less than good idea, if there's any way you can sort of junk it, then it falls by the wayside for me. But if you find yourself lying awake at night and saying, gee, wouldn't it be cool if, then you're sort of off and running.
Right.
And whether you've sold the book or you haven't sold the book, it doesn't make any difference. You will not be able to stop. I will not be able to stop.
Fair enough. All right, that was great. But now it's time for a special segment of the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get. And the categories are Stranger in a Strange Land, The Game is Afoot, Reporting for Duty, Music Lover, Dream Weaver, Trick or Treat, and Elementary, My Dear Watson. All right, you ready?
I don't know.
All right, well, let's see what we got for you. You got Music Lover. Okay. All right. What song or piece of music do you love no matter how many times you hear it?
Carmen by George Bizet.
Really? Huh.
I heard it when I was 5 years old. I was on my way to bed and I came down like I was drawn by a magnet. And I've been obsessed with it ever since. And I think George Bizet is the composer with whom I most identify as an artist, not in terms of talent. I don't presume any such thing, but just in terms of sensibility. I think the combination in Bizet that I detect of a kind of outward exuberance and excitement and exhilaration coupled with an extreme heart of darkness, which is really sort of what Carmen contains. Just I glommed onto that at as I say, 5 years old, and it never let go of me.
All right.
There's other music that I recognize as better. Beethoven is a better composer than Bizet. I get that. Bach is a better composer. And arguably, and I'm a big opera fan, so Puccini and late Verdi, all that stuff. Sondheim, Gershwin, it goes on and on and on. But Bizet is the one that has the first claim on that inmost part of me.
Right. All right. Thanks, Nick. So we're going to go to our advice column. So you and I are both in the writing business to varying degrees. So what's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you?
I don't know whether this was good advice or bad advice, but somewhere along the line, someone said to me, if you want to be a writer, you should write.
Right.
There's how-to books and there's this and that. I think you can't teach talent.
Right.
No, I don't know that anybody taught Shakespeare or had him read Aristotle's Poetics or anything that the rest of us could use. He just had it. But you can teach technique. You can learn tricks.
Yep.
You can learn ways to analyze things. Before I took courses at Iowa, I think it was safe to say that I was doing a lot of things by instinct that were right. But if the thing didn't work, I didn't know why it didn't work, and I didn't know how to fix it.
Right.
And that's what technique teaches you. The most intriguing piece of advice that I ever got, and I don't remember from whom, was somebody said, write about what you don't know.
Right. Expand the mind. All right. So we're going to take a couple of questions. I got one here for you now. So Nick, was there a particular Sherlock Holmes tale that influenced you to write your own?
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't say so. I think it was a cumulative thing. There are Sherlock Holmes stories that I love. The Bruce Partinson plans, the Devil's Foot, the Silver Blaze, the Red-Headed League, obviously A Study in Scarlet, the Hound of the Baskervilles, even though he's not in it that much. The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, I don't know if I mentioned that. The Yellow Face, where Holmes is wrong. There's many, but I think it was the cumulative effect,
right,
of these stories and the very distinct way the characters sort of interacted, Holmes and Watson, that was kind of easy to imitate, or at least I thought it was easy.
Fair enough. Okay, so I got two more for you. So we're going to go back to Star Trek a little bit. So how was it to work with Nimoy?
Well, I worked with him 3 times. I worked with him in 2. I worked with him on Star Trek 4, which I co-wrote or wrote a great deal of, and he directed. And I worked with him on 6, where I co-wrote the script and directed him again. Leonard was a consummate professional. He'd been acting literally for many, many years. He had a much longer CV than I did. He knew what was proper. He knew what was not proper. He was responsible. He was sober, dedicated, punctual. He had professionalism was sort of ingrained in him. Everybody who works on Star Trek writes a memoir. And whenever I'm at a bookstore and I see a Star Trek memoir, of course, the first thing we all do is turn to the index. You know, how do I come out?
Right.
And I saw one of Leonard's memoirs once, and he was writing about doing Spock's death scene in The Wrath of Khan. And he remembered with some irritation that I showed up the day he shot his death scene dressed as Sherlock Holmes, which he thought was extremely insensitive given what he was going through.
Wow.
Now, memory is a tricky thing. I've never dressed as Sherlock Holmes in my life. I was not dressed as Sherlock Holmes, but we were shooting at the Paramount Studios. And in those days, Los Angeles did not have its own opera company. We had the now defunct, alas, New York City Opera, which would come out to Los Angeles for 3 weeks every year. And being the opera screwball that I am, I would go every night. And I would put on a suit because I was going to the opera after we wrapped. I was in a suit. I wasn't dressed as Sherlock Holmes.
Wow.
But he remembered it in this very curious way.
At any point, did you ever address it with him later and talk about that?
Nah.
Just let it be, huh? You don't want to mess with Spock.
Believe me, you don't.
Right. Fair enough. All right. Well, last question. Okay. I'm a Sherlockian and a Trekker, but I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about Time After Time, one of my favorite films. Anything else that you'd like to share? I mean, we covered it, but anything from the movie that, I don't know, anything else we didn't touch on before?
Well, I'm sure there are different stories, but the first one that comes to mind was this was the first movie I'd ever directed. So I clearly didn't know what I was doing. But at one point, the wife of my producer, Herb Jaffe's wife, Nell, said, you know, she said, I think Malcolm and Mary are falling in love. And I said, no, I'm directing. I directed this. This is the result of my work, my artistry. Yeah, because sometimes the director don't know what's going on.
Okay, fair.
I just, I'd look at these scenes and I'd think to myself, wow, Meyer, you are good. And I remember that the first time I ever met Malcolm was in a tea shop on Madison Avenue in New York. And he said, now my leading lady, who is she? And I said, don't worry, you're going to love her. Took direction.
Okay, fair enough. That must have been trippy too. I mean, he had just come off of, I mean, maybe not just, but he was so memorable in A Clockwork Orange, who was this, couldn't have been more opposite than.
Well, he was always getting typecast as villains.
Right.
And that's what Warner Brothers said when I said, well, what about Malcolm? And they said, but he's always the villain. And I said, so this time he'll be the hero, and that's called acting.
Right.
And they went, oh, okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Look, that was great. But before we wrap, I want to just go. I'm going to share my screen again. I want to go back to Return of the Pharaoh. So just tell us again. It'll be out next month, correct?
It comes out November 9th from the Minotaur Press, and I think it's a really good book. But what do I know at this point?
I think a decent amount. So what's next for you?
It's a guess. It's a guess.
What's next?
Well, I'm working. I did this television series that I co-wrote and created with Frank Spotton. It's called Medici, Masters of Florence. And Frank and I are involved in another project which we're in the middle of setting up, which we've been working on for the past year, and we'll see what happens with it.
That's great.
And then I've got another Sherlock Holmes in my head. If Minotaur is interested, I'll go to work on it.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Nick. That was fantastic. As for me, if you're up for a little sci-fi with your crime and mystery, I'll encourage you to check out my sci-fi noir,
Look at that.
Fractured Lives, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, part Doctor Who, part Blade Runner, and part Philip Marlowe. In Fractured Lives, Hardwick is hired to find out if a college freshman who is also a galaxy design savant is suffering from a nervous breakdown or is the victim of an urban legend known as the Scarlet Raj. Fractured Lives is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And if you want a signed copy, you can order one directly from me. All right. Well, Nick, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us. This was really a fantastic hour. And I want to thank everyone who's watching at home. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks a lot, folks. And thanks again, Nick. This was great.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Take care, folks. All right.